started on your day 2 notes over conditional statements. And today we're going to talk about related conditionals. We're going to look at a conditional statement and we're going to write its converse, inverse, and contrapositive. Then we're going to determine the truth value of each statement. Recall that a conditional statement is written in the form if P, then Q. I've got the symbols right here in this column, if P, then Q, and I've color-coded it so that P, which represents the hypothesis, is in red, and Q, which represents the conclusion, is in blue. In this next column, I've got an example. If two angles are vertical angles, then they are congruent. What do we know? Two angles are vertical, then they are congruent. Vertical angles are congruent. The truth value of this statement is T, represents true. Now let's look at the converse of this statement. The converse of this statement, we're going to rewrite this statement, but we're going to switch Q and P. We're just going to switch the order so that the hypothesis is Q and the conclusion is P. So instead of if two angles are vertical angles, then they are congruent. If they are congruent, then they are two vertical angles. We're just switching the order. And if you need to pause the video to write this down, go ahead and do that now. I'm going to go pretty quickly through this. So if they are congruent, then they are two vertical angles. Let's talk about this statement's truth value. Do they have to be vertical angles to be congruent angles? They do not. They can be congruent angles, but not be vertical angles. So this statement's truth value is false. Now let's talk about the inverse of that conditional statement. It's formed by negating the hypothesis and conclusion. So recall, how do we negate a statement? As we throw in that word not. So remember, we're going back to the original order, okay, P then Q, but we're going to negate each, the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if not P, which that's what that symbol represents, right? If that little tilde, if not P, then not Q. So how would I write that? If two angles are not vertical angles, then they are not congruent. So I'm negating the hypothesis right here and the conclusion right here. If they are not vertical angles, then they are not congruent. Again, could we have congruent angles that are not vertical? We could. So this statement's truth value is false. Let's move on to the last related conditional. It's contrapositive. We're going to switch the order and we're going to negate the hypothesis and conclusion right here. So instead of, we're starting with if P then Q, we're switching the order and we're negating the hypothesis and conclusion. So if they are not congruent, then they are not two vertical angles. If they are not congruent, we know vertical angles must be congruent. So if they're not congruent, then they're not vertical angles, which means this statement's truth value is true. So I do want to point something out. Let me see if I can change the color here. We'll do green. Right here, this word converse, it's got con, and contrapositive, it's got con. What do you notice about the order that you've written your statement? We're starting with the conclusion. So we switch right here, okay? If Q, then P for the converse, and if not Q, then not P. So if it's got that word con in front, you're switching the order, okay? The converse is just if Q, then P, and the contrapositive, you switch them and you negate them. So let's talk about logically equivalent statements. Those are related conditionals that have the same truth value. So which statements here are logically equivalent? We have the conditional statement and its contrapositive that are logically equivalent. And we have the converse and the inverse that are logically equivalent. They're the same. They have the same truth value. So logically equivalent statements, a conditional and its contrapositive are always logically equivalent, and the converse and the inverse are always logically equivalent. Let's move on. I've got two examples here We're going to work through them and we're going to write the converse, inverse, and the contrapositive for this conditional. We're going to determine the truth value of each one, and then we're going to find which statements are logically equivalent. So in example number 1, if two angles are congruent, then they have equal degree measures. This is our conditional. Let's first identify the hypothesis and the conclusion. If two angles are congruent, so two angles are congruent, that's our hypothesis. What's our conclusion? It follows the word then. They have equal degree measures. So recall that a conditional statement is written if P then Q. So we're started with the hypothesis, ending with the conclusion. The truth value of this statement is congruent angles have equal degree measures. So that's true. So how are we going to write the converse of this conditional? What do we do for the converse? We're going to switch Q and P. So we're going to switch the hypothesis and conclusion. What is this going to look like? If they have equal degree measures, then they are congruent angles. Or two angles are congruent, however you want to write it. But we're switching the order. Again, if you need to pause the video, go ahead and do that. But if they have equal degree measures, then they are congruent angles. That's a true statement. Let's move on to the inverse. It doesn't have that word con in front, so we're not switching the order. But the inverse, we're going to negate P and negate Q. So if not P, then not Q. How are we going to, what is that going to look like? Negate the hypothesis and negate the conclusion. If two angles are not congruent, then they do not have equal degree measures. That truth value is true. If they're not congruent, they don't have equal degree measures. Now let's move on to the contrapositive. The contrapositive, con is in front, so we're going to switch the order, okay? So if Q, then P, but we're going to negate both the hypothesis and conclusion. So if not Q, then not P. Let's start with Q. If they do not have equal degree measures, then they are not congruent angles. If two angles do not have equal degree measures, then they are not congruent angles. That statement's truth value is T. That is a true statement. So which statements are logically equivalent? All related conditionals are logically equivalent. If you need to catch up, go ahead and pause the video now. Let's move on to example number 2, which this is our last example. The statement says, if it is raining, then there are clouds in the sky. The first thing I want you to do is pause the video and identify the hypothesis and conclusion of this statement. It is raining is our hypothesis, that's P. There are clouds in the sky. That's our conclusion, that's Q. The conditional is written if P then Q, and I've got it already written there for you. If it is raining, then there are clouds in the sky. Truth value, that's true, okay? If it is raining, then there are clouds in the sky. We need clouds to produce rain. The converse of this statement, what do? I flip Q and P. So the converse, if there are clouds in the sky, then it is raining. I'm just switching Q and P, okay? I'm switching the order. If there are clouds in the sky, then it is raining. Is that a true statement or a false statement? Have you ever seen clouds in the sky and it not be raining? Yes, so this statement is false. Now let's move back to the inverse, okay? The inverse, I'm going back to the same order, okay? If P, then Q, but I'm going to negate P and negate Q. How do I do that? What do you think that would look like? If it is not raining, then there are not clouds in the sky. If it is not raining, then there are not clouds in the sky. Again, could there be clouds in the sky and it not be raining? Yes, so this statement is false. Let's move on to the contrapositive, the last related conditional. That con is in front, okay, the prefix. We know that when that con is in front, we're going to switch the order, if Q then P, and the contrapositive tells us we need to negate the hypothesis and conclusion. So we're switching the order. If there are not clouds in the sky, then it is not raining. Well, we know we need clouds in the sky for it to be raining. So if there are not clouds in the sky and it's not raining, that statement is true. Which statements are logically equivalent? Remember, logically equivalent statements have the same truth value. The conditional and contrapositive are logically equivalent, and the converse and inverse are logically equivalent. And that concludes your day 2 notes over conditional statements.